Dust Creek had seen hard men do hard things, but nothing like this. The crowd gathered in silence, hats pulled low, eyes down. Nobody wanted to be seen watching. Nobody wanted to be seen turning away. A young woman with her hands bound and her father 3 weeks in the ground sold off like a mule at market because a debt collector said the math didn't add up. The bidding had already started. The numbers were climbing. And then, hooves, slow, deliberate, like thunder deciding whether or not to bother. Press like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Debt. The morning Rowan Hale was put up for auction, the sky was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, the kind of sky that made livestock uneasy and dogs bark at nothing. It hadn't rained in 61 days. The creek that gave the town its name had pulled back to a thin, muddy ribbon barely wide enough to wet a boot, and the dust that rose from Main Street with every gust of wind tasted of alkali and something older and drier than either. She had been awake since before first light, not because anyone had given her warning, they hadn't. The 2 men from the Territorial Debt Office had arrived at the Hale Ranch the previous evening with a leather satchel full of paperwork, and the kind of patience that comes from doing unpleasant things for long enough that they stop feeling unpleasant. They had let her pack 1 bag. 1. She had stood in her father's room for a long moment, looking at the bureau where he kept his razor and his pocket watch, and then she'd walked out without touching anything, because she didn't know how to choose which part of a dead man to carry with her. They'd put her in the back room of the sheriff's office overnight. Not a cell, exactly. The lock didn't work, and there were no bars. But the message was the same. Stay. Wait. Don't cause trouble. She hadn't slept. By the time the sun cleared the ridge to the east and started its slow, punishing climb, Rowan had already decided 2 things. She was not going to cry in public, and she was not going to beg. Those were the only 2 things she could control, and she held on to them the way you hold on to a fence post in a flash flood. Not because the post will save you, but because letting go guarantees you drown. The deputy who came to collect her at 8:30 was a young man named Briggs, who couldn't have been older than 22 and who kept his eyes on the floor when he spoke to her. "They're ready," he said. "I imagine they are," Rowan said. Main Street was already lined with people when they came out. That surprised her. Not that people had come, but how many. Dust Creek had maybe 300 souls on a busy day, but it looked like all of them had found reason to be within sight of the auction platform the debt collectors had erected at the north end of the street, in front of what used to be the feed store before Harlan Pruitt drank himself into bankruptcy 2 winters back. The platform was nothing fancy. 4 posts, some rough-cut boards, a couple of steps up from the street. They'd hung a banner across the front that said, Territorial Debt Settlement, Public Auction, in black letters that had already started bleeding in the heat. Someone had nailed it crooked, and no one had bothered to fix it. Rowan walked the length of Main Street between Deputy Briggs and a heavy-set man from the debt office named Tolliver, who wore a brown coat despite the heat and sweated through it impressively. She kept her eyes straight ahead. She could feel the crowd watching her, and she could feel the specific quality of that watching, the way it tried to look like it wasn't watching. People stared at their boots, or found something interesting in the sky, or talked to the person next to them about something that clearly had nothing to do with what was happening on the street. It was the look of a town that was ashamed of itself, but not ashamed enough to leave. She knew most of these people. Tom Garrett, who ran the dry goods store, had bought eggs from her father for 6 years. The Calloway sisters, who sat together in the front pew at services every week, had come to her mother's funeral when Rowan was 9 years old and brought a pie that she still remembered as the best thing she'd ever tasted. Old Pete Markham, who leaned on his fence post at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in an expression she couldn't quite read. He had helped her father birth a difficult calf just last spring, and afterward the 2 of them had sat on the porch and passed a bottle back and forth until the stars came out. None of them met her eyes. She climbed the steps to the platform and turned around and faced the crowd, and she did not cry, and she did not beg. And she made herself stand straight even though her legs felt like they were made of something less reliable than bone. Tolliver cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. Under provisions of the Territorial Debt Settlement Act, the estate of the late Caleb Hale, including the Hale Ranch property at mile marker 14 on the old northern road, its structures, water rights, and remaining livestock, has been seized in satisfaction of outstanding debts totaling $4,218. He paused to let that number settle. Additionally, as the sole remaining dependent of the deceased, Miss Rowan Hale, age 23, is subject to indentured labor settlement, terms not to exceed 3 years, in satisfaction of said debt. Someone in the crowd shifted. Someone else coughed. Rowan had known this was coming. She'd heard Tolliver explain it twice, once the night before and once that morning, in the flat, rehearsed tone of a man who had memorized the legal language so he didn't have to think about what it meant. She'd understood it intellectually, but standing on a platform in front of the people she'd grown up around, hearing the words spoken aloud into the hot morning air, that was a different kind of knowing. 3 years. 3 years of her life to be purchased by whoever offered the most money to the man with the clipboard. "We'll begin the bidding," Tolliver said, "at $200. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd was still. Rowan let herself believe for just that moment that no one would bid, that the people of Dust Creek would look at what was being done and refuse to participate in it, that they would turn their backs or walk away or say something. Then Walt Gruber's hand went up. Walt Gruber owned the largest cattle operation east of the ridge, about 15,000 acres of not quite worthless land that he'd been aggressively expanding for the past decade by buying out his neighbors at prices they couldn't refuse when the drought came and the money ran out. He was 50-something, heavy-set in the way of men who had been powerful when they were young and had since gone soft without losing the conviction that they were still powerful. He had a way of looking at things, livestock, land, people, that reduced everything to a calculation. $250, he said. His voice was flat, neither embarrassed nor triumphant, just business. A ripple went through the crowd. Not exactly disapproval. Something more complicated than that. Like they'd all been holding their breath waiting to see if someone would do it, and now that someone had, they didn't quite know what they felt about it. A second hand went up from the back of the crowd. Rowan couldn't see who it belonged to. $300, said a voice she didn't recognize. Gruber didn't even turn around. $350. The bidding moved the way these things do. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the grinding, inexorable momentum of machinery that has been set in motion and will not stop until it reaches its end. 400, 450, 500. The unknown voice in the back dropped out around 550. For a moment, Gruber seemed to have it, and Rowan watched his expression shift almost imperceptibly. The faintest loosening around the eyes, the beginning of satisfaction. Then a new voice entered from the left side of the crowd. 600. Gruber turned. The new bidder was a man named Colton Marsh, who ran a sheep operation on the far side of the dry riverbed and had a reputation for being unpleasant in a more personal way than Gruber, not calculating exactly, just mean in the specific way of men who have never faced any real consequence for their meanness. He was younger than Gruber by maybe 15 years, thin and weathered, with eyes that sat too close together and a smile that never quite reached them. 650, Gruber said, and now there was a note of irritation in it. 750. The crowd had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Whatever discomfort they'd been feeling had given way to something harder to name, a kind of terrible fascination, the way people watch a fire. Rowan looked out at their faces, all of them turned toward her or toward the bidders, and she thought, this is what we are. Not the two men bidding on her. Not Tolliver with his brown coat and his clipboard. Not even the debt collectors who'd shown up at her door with their satchel full of paperwork. Just this. A crowd of ordinary people watching, not stopping it, not walking away, letting it happen because it was easier than the alternative. 800, Marsh said. Gruber hesitated. Rowan saw it. Just half a second. Just the flicker of a man reconsidering whether she was worth what this was costing him. Then, 850. Marsh's jaw tightened. 900. The platform boards were rough under her feet. She could feel a splinter working at the sole of her boot. The sun was full up now, hammering down on the top of her head with the particular cruelty of a June morning in the Badlands, and sweat was forming at her hairline and running down the back of her neck, and she stood completely still and did not reach up to wipe it away because she refused, She absolutely refused to let any of them see her fidget. 900, Tolliver repeated. Do I hear 950? Gruber looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Gruber. Something passed between them, some negotiation conducted entirely in the stubborn set of two men's faces. Then Gruber shook his head. 900 then, Tolliver said, and his pen moved toward the paper, and Rowan felt something cold close around her chest. Not panic, not quite, more like the sensation of a door swinging shut on the last room that still had light in it. And then she heard the hooves. No. She heard them before anyone else seemed to, which maybe meant she was listening for something. Any sound at all that wasn't Tolliver's pen, wasn't Marsh's flat expression, wasn't the shuffling of the crowd. The hooves were slow, deliberate. One horse, not a group of riders, moving at a pace that was neither urgent nor casual, but something else entirely. The pace of someone who has decided exactly how long this should take and intends to take exactly that long and not a second more. The crowd heard them next. Heads turned. People at the edges of the street stepped back without quite meaning to. The horse came around the corner from the alley beside the dry goods store. A big, dark bay with a white blaze on its face that looked almost like a scar, moving at a collected walk that somehow conveyed more authority than a gallop. The man on its back sat the way men sit when riding is so natural to them that they've stopped thinking about it, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on his thigh, his hat pulled against the sun at an angle that kept most of his face in shadow. Rowan had never seen Darius Crow in person before. She'd heard of him, the same way everyone in the territory had heard of him. In pieces, in fragments, in the careful way people talk about things they're not sure they believe. That he'd come up from nowhere 15 years ago, a drifter who'd taken a job at a failing ranch and somehow ended up owning it. That he'd expanded his holdings in the Badlands by a combination of hard work, sharp dealing, and a willingness to have conversations that other men found discouraging. That he'd broken a cattle rustling ring 3 years back, not by calling in the law, but by riding to the ringleader's camp alone and returning 2 days later without further discussion of the matter, and the rustling had stopped. That he was not a man given to explanations or apologies. That the land he held, over 20,000 acres in the rough country north and west of the ridge, he held absolutely, and everyone who had ever tested that understood why they didn't test it again. He was, by most accounts, not quite 40. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a face that had been cut by wind and sun, and something harder than either into something that wasn't exactly handsome, but was something more specific. The face of a man who had made a series of choices and had long since stopped regretting them. He brought the horse to a stop at the edge of the platform. The crowd parted around him without discussion. Tolliver looked up from his papers. "Sir, the auction is nearly—" "I heard," Crow said. His voice was low and even, and it carried in the dry air the way a gunshot carries. Not loud, but with the quality of something that makes you understand the silence around it. Tolliver waited. 900, Colton Marsh said from somewhere to Rowan's left, a little louder than necessary, like he was reminding everyone that he was the one with the winning bid. Crow looked at him. Just looked. Marsh's expression didn't exactly change, but he stopped talking. Then Crow looked up at Rowan for the first time. She met his eyes and didn't look away. Not out of bravado, because she was too tired for bravado and too past caring to perform it, but because there was something in his face that wasn't the thing she'd been seeing all morning. Not pity, exactly. Not calculation. Something harder to categorize. "This is a debt auction," he said, still looking at her, speaking to Tolliver. "That's correct, sir. Under territorial." "I know what it is." He shifted his gaze to the clipboard. "What's the total debt?" Tolliver blinked. The total outstanding debt of the Hale estate is $4,218, but the terms of the auction, $4,218, Crow said. He reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet, worn thin in the way of things that are used constantly and not replaced, and opened it and removed a folded piece of paper and held it out to Tolliver without dismounting. "Bank draft. You can verify it with the First Territorial in Redstone." The crowd went very still. Tolliver took the draft with the expression of a man who has encountered a situation not covered in his training. He unfolded it. He looked at the number. He looked at Crow. Sir, the terms of the auction don't allow for some. The terms of the auction, Crow said, are designed to settle the outstanding debt. I'm settling the outstanding debt, in full, plus interest at the rate specified in the act. He let that sit for a moment. Or do the terms of the auction exist for some other purpose? Dead silence. Marsh took a step forward. Now hold on just a... Mr. Marsh. Crow turned his head, just slightly, just enough. I'm going to ask you to not finish that sentence. Something happened in Colton Marsh's face, something that moved through it quickly, like a shadow crossing ground, and then was gone, and what replaced it was a very careful neutrality. He didn't finish the sentence. Tolliver looked at the bank draft again. He looked at Crow. He looked at the crowd, as if seeking some guidance from them, and found none. The debt, Crow said, is settled. The land reverts to the estate. The indentured labor auction is moot. He glanced up at the banner. Unless there's some other purpose to this. Tolliver's mouth opened, closed. He shuffled his papers, which appeared to be a reflex rather than a purposeful action. I would need to verify the draft. Then verify it, Crow said. I'll wait. He didn't move, didn't shift in the saddle, didn't look at the crowd or at Marsh or at anyone except the point in the middle distance he seemed to have selected for the duration of this conversation. And Tolliver, who was a man of small courage and reasonable self-preservation instincts, looked at the bank draft one more time and arrived at a decision. The auction, he said carefully, is suspended pending verification of payment. He looked at Rowan. Miss Hale, you are, provisionally, released. Rowan came down from the platform on her own. She didn't take the hand Deputy Briggs offered, not out of pride, but because her legs had done fine on the way up, and she didn't see any reason to change the arrangement now. The boards gave slightly under her feet, dry and stressed from the sun, and she stepped down to the street and stood for a moment in the dust while the crowd sorted out what it was doing. Most of them dispersed. Not quickly. People move the way they do when something has happened that they want to be able to say they witnessed, without having to immediately say what they thought of it. Quietly, in ones and twos, not meeting each other's eyes much. Gruber left without a word. Marsh lingered at the edge of the street for a moment, looking at Crow with the expression of a man making calculations, and then he left too. Tolliver was still standing on the platform with his papers, looking like a man waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. Rowan stood in the street and looked up at Darius Crow, who was still on his horse, still watching the point in the middle distance. Why? She said. It wasn't a full sentence. She hadn't intended it as one, but he seemed to understand it anyway. He looked down at her. Because it was the thing that needed doing. You don't know me. No. You paid $4,000 for someone you don't know. 4,218, he said, with a precision that seemed almost dry, plus interest. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. She had been awake for over 20 hours. She had stood on a platform in front of her neighbors and been assigned a price. She was standing in the dust of Main Street in a town that had watched and said nothing, and the man who had stopped it was a stranger whose reputation was more complicated than a first impression could contain, and she was not going to cry. She had decided that, and she intended to keep it. But something shifted in her chest that felt like the released pressure of a held breath, painful and necessary at the same time. What happens now? She asked. That depends on what you want, he said. What are my options? He considered. You can go back to your ranch. The debt's settled. No one has a legal claim on it. You'd be alone, and there are people in this territory who won't be pleased about this morning, but it's yours. He paused. Or you can come with me. Get some distance from Dust Creek while the paperwork gets sorted. Think about your next move somewhere that isn't standing in the street. And what would you want in exchange for that? Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, something that occupied the same territory without fully arriving. Nothing today, he said. We can discuss the rest of it when you've had some sleep. It was not, objectively, a very reassuring answer. He was a stranger with a fearsome reputation offering her shelter in exchange for vague future terms. And the sensible thing, the cautious thing, the thing that a woman in her position with any self-preservation instinct should do, was to decline and figure out her own way forward. But Rowan had watched the cautious, self-preserving people of Dust Creek this morning, and she had noted what caution looked like when it was pointed in the wrong direction, and she made a decision. "I need my bag," she said. "They left it at the sheriff's office." "Then get your bag," Crow said. She got her bag. Yun. They rode north out of Dust Creek in the late morning with the sun already high and vicious overhead, and the dust rising behind them in a plume that Rowan watched over her shoulder until the town disappeared behind the first ridge. She was on a spare horse from Crow's remuda, a gray mare with a white mane that moved quietly and had a soft mouth, and was, in Rowan's estimation, considerably better mannered than most of the humans she'd encountered in the last 12 hours. She sat the horse without conversation. Crow rode beside her and also without conversation, which she appreciated. She'd had, in the 3 weeks since her father died, plenty of people who felt that silence needed filling. Neighbors who came by with food and words in equal measure, most of the words being about how sorry they were, and how good Caleb Hale had been, and how terrible this was, all of it true and none of it useful. The debt collectors who'd explained everything twice. The sheriff who'd told her, apologetically, that there wasn't anything he could do. The paperwork was in order, the debt was verified, the law said what it said. Everyone with things to say, and none of the things particularly relevant to the problem at hand. Crow didn't say anything for the first 2 hours. Somewhere past the dry creek bed north of town, where the trail narrowed between 2 limestone outcroppings, and the country started going from merely hard to genuinely inhospitable, she found herself appreciating this more than she'd expected. It was close to noon when he spoke. "Your father was Caleb Hale." "Yes?" "I met him once, 3-4 years ago, cattle sale in Redstone." Rowan glanced over. "He never mentioned you." "I wouldn't have expected him to. It was a brief conversation." A pause. "He seemed like a man who knew what he was worth, not always the same thing as knowing what things cost." That was, Rowan thought, more accurately said than most of the eulogies she'd heard. She didn't respond to it, but she didn't dismiss it either. "The debt," she said after a moment. "Was it real?" "I don't know yet." "You paid $4,000 for a debt you don't know is real?" "I paid $4,000 for a debt I intend to investigate," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. "You think it was manufactured?" "I think," Crow said carefully, in the voice of a man who chooses his words because words have consequences, that Caleb Hale ran that ranch for 23 years without ever being significantly in debt. And then in the span of 8 months he owed more than the land was worth. That's a sequence of events worth understanding. The trail climbed through a series of switchbacks into rougher country, the kind of landscape that looked hostile at first, and then, as you moved through it, revealed itself to be something else. Not hostile exactly, but honest. No pretense about what it was. The rock was red-brown and the sky was a hard blue, and the only sounds were wind and the horse's hooves on the stone and somewhere far off the cry of a hawk. "What's on your land?" Crow asked. She looked at him. "The ranch," he said. "What does it have that somebody else would want?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she'd been asked. It was not a question she'd asked herself. In the weeks of grief and confusion and bureaucratic humiliation that had preceded this morning, she'd been too busy surviving the present to think backward about causes. But now, turning it over. "Water," she said. Crow looked at her. "There's a spring on the southeast corner," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "My father's grandfather found it when he first settled the land. There's a natural basin in the rock. In dry years like this one, it's the only reliable water source in the area. My father watered his stock from it and let the neighbors draw from it when they needed. He never charged for it." She paused. "He said water in a dry country was like air, something you don't own. You just hold it for a while and pass it on." She heard her own voice say the last sentence and felt the grief hit her again, sudden and sideways the way grief does when you've been keeping it at a careful distance. Her father's voice in her mouth, his words, his belief that had made him generous and that had, she now understood, made him a target. "Nobody knew about the spring?" Crow said. "Everyone knew," she said. "That's the point. The whole county knew my father had water when no one else did. He just never thought of it as leverage. Crow was quiet for a long moment. They crested a rise, and below them spread the first view of the Badlands proper. A rolling landscape of broken rock and dry arroyos and wind-twisted juniper, harsh and enormous, and in its own way beautiful. His ranch was out there somewhere, Rowan knew, 20,000 acres of land that most people considered not worth farming, and he had made into something. The Dunmore Land Syndicate, she said. The name had come to her without quite knowing where from. Something she'd overheard at the land office, maybe, or something her father had mentioned in the last months, distracted and worried in a way he'd tried to hide from her. Have you heard of them? Crow turned his head to look at her. Yes. Who are they? Land speculators, he said, based out of the territorial capital. They've been active in this region for about 3 years, buying up distressed properties. Another pause, slightly longer than the ones before. Their primary investor is a man named Silas Voss. The name didn't mean anything to Rowan. She said so. It will, Crow said, and he clicked to his horse and moved it ahead on the trail, and she followed because there was nothing else to do, and because somewhere far behind them in the dust and the heat, something was already in motion that neither of them had fully named yet. The Crow Ranch. It didn't have a proper name, or if it did, no one used it. People just said the Crow Place, the same way they say the Crow Place in the Badlands, and everyone knows what they mean. Sat in a wide, shallow valley between two rock ridges, accessible by a single road that dropped sharply from the rim and then leveled out onto a plain of grass that was, in this drought year, somewhere between brown and gold and fighting to stay closer to gold. The main house was larger than she'd expected, not grand, not the studied grandeur of a man who wants people to see what he owns, but built solidly, built to last, with thick adobe walls and a deep porch that ran across the front face and would be cool in summer and shelter in winter. The outbuildings were well maintained, the fences were in repair, 3 hands she could see from the road, each of them doing something purposeful, each of them glancing at the newcomer and then going back to their work without comment. It was, she thought, a place that worked. Not performed work, not the appearance of industry, but actual function. The kind of place where things happened because they needed to happen and someone had arranged for them to happen. Her father's ranch had been like that before. A woman came out of the house as they rode into the yard. She was maybe 60, broad and dark-haired going to silver, with the kind of face that has laugh lines and doesn't waste them. "Mr. Crow," she said. "Mrs. Aldana," he said. He dismounted and handed off his horse to a hand who appeared without being summoned. "We have a guest, Miss Rowan Hale. She'll need a room and something to eat, in that order. Mrs." Aldana looked at Rowan with the frank, assessing look of a woman who has spent decades managing a large household and does not require much explanation. "Miss Hale," she said, "come in out of the sun." Rowan dismounted. Her legs were steadier than she'd expected. She retrieved her bag from behind the saddle and followed the woman up the porch steps and through the heavy wooden door into the cool dimness of the house. And she heard Crow's boots on the porch behind them, and then the sound of him going somewhere else. And she let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting since early morning. The room they gave her was small and clean, with a window that faced west and a bed that had a real mattress and a quilt that had been washed recently enough to still smell faintly of the soap. Mrs. Aldana set a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser and showed her where the towels were kept and told her food would be in an hour and then left her alone, which was, Rowan decided, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 3 weeks. She sat on the edge of the bed. The morning she'd laid her father out had been bad. The morning she'd found the debt collectors on her porch had been bad in a different, colder way. The morning she'd stood on a platform in the dust of Main Street, that had been something she didn't have a word for yet, something that hadn't finished becoming the shape it was going to be in her memory. But this room, this window, this hour, felt like a pause. Like the story had stopped for a moment to let her catch up to it. She unpacked her bag slowly. A change of clothes. Her father's pocket watch. She had taken it, in the end, standing in his room while the debt collectors waited downstairs, feeling that if she left it, they would have it and it would end up as a number on a balance sheet. A small photograph, edges worn soft, of her parents on their wedding day. A folding knife her father had given her when she was 12, and she'd never not had since. She set the watch on the windowsill where the afternoon light would catch it. She was not going to be auctioned. She was not going to be bought. She was not going to let the ranch her grandfather built and her father kept and her mother loved end up as a line in a land speculator's ledger. She didn't know yet how to stop that from happening. She didn't know who Silas Voss was, or what the Dunmore Land Syndicate intended, or what Darius Crowe expected in return for $4,000 and a bed in a strange house. She didn't know who her allies were, or if she had any, or what the law would and wouldn't do for a 23-year-old woman with no family and a just-settled debt. What she knew was this. She had stood on a platform this morning in front of 300 people who had looked away, and she had not looked away from any of them. She had watched their faces. She knew what they looked like when they were ashamed of what they were permitting, and she thought there might be something useful in that, in the shame of people who don't know yet that they have a choice. She picked up her father's watch and held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the solidity of something that had been touched by hands that weren't there anymore. I'm going to get it back, she thought, all of it. She didn't say it aloud. There was no one to say it to, and she didn't need the sound of it in the room to make it true. She'd already decided. The decision had been made somewhere between the third bid and the sound of hoofbeats, somewhere in the moment when the door was swinging shut, and then it hadn't. She set the watch back on the windowsill. Outside, the afternoon light was coming in long and gold through the western-facing glass, and the Badlands spread away in every direction toward a horizon that was too big to fit in any frame. And somewhere out there in the dust and the heat and the dry and the distance, something that belonged to her was waiting to be reclaimed. She was going to be hungry. She was going to be rested. She was going to be clear-headed. And then she was going to find out exactly who Silas Voss was, and exactly what he'd done, and exactly how to make him answer for it. She slept 11 hours and woke up angry. Not the sharp, immediate anger of fresh injury that had burned itself down sometime in the night, leaving something slower and more useful in its place. The kind of anger that doesn't need to shout. The kind that sits in the chest like a coal and gives off steady heat and doesn't go out when the wind picks up. She lay in the bed in the small west-facing room and listened to the sounds of a working ranch in the early morning, the low conversation of cattle somewhere distant, the clang of metal from the direction of the barn, someone crossing the yard at a quick walk, and she thought about water. Not abstractly, specifically. The spring on the southeast corner of the Hale Ranch, the one her great-grandfather had found when he first settled the land, the one her father had treated as common property while drought tightened around the county like a fist. She thought about how a man might sit in an office somewhere in the territorial capital and look at a map and see not a spring, but a weapon. Not a family's livelihood, but leverage. She thought about how the gap between those two ways of seeing the same thing was the exact distance between her father's grave and a platform in Main Street. By the time Mrs. Aldana knocked with coffee and bread, Rowan had already been dressed for an hour. Crowe was in the room he used as an office, less a formal space than a large table covered with maps and correspondence that had clearly lost any original organizational system and was now arranged according to the logic of a man who knows where everything is and doesn't require anyone else to. He was standing at the table with a mug in his hand when she came in, reading something, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had half expected her to still be sleeping. "I want to know about Silas Voss," she said. He set down the mug. "Good morning." "Good morning. I want to know about Silas Voss." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, not quite approval. That territory between the two that she was starting to learn was as close to either as he generally got. He pulled out a chair across the table and sat down, which she took as an invitation, and she sat too. "Voss came into this territory about 4 years ago," he said. "Started as a money lender. Small operations. Bridge loans to ranchers in bad seasons. The kind of thing that looks like charity until you read the terms. By the time a man understood what he'd signed, Voss had a legal claim on 30% of his land." He picked up the mug again, turned it in his hands without drinking from it. "The Dunmore Land Syndicate came about 2 years later. That's the formal mechanism, the legal entity that holds the land claims. Voss is the operating mind, but there are investors behind him in the capital. Men with names that appear on courthouse buildings. How much land do they hold? In this region, 11 properties that I know of, probably more that haven't surfaced yet. He paused. Your father's ranch would be the 12th, and the most valuable. Because of the water. Because of the water, he confirmed. In a drought year, whoever controls that spring controls which operations survive and which don't. That's not a resource, that's a monopoly. He set the mug down finally. Voss isn't a rancher. He doesn't want to run cattle. He wants to own the thing that everyone else needs to run cattle and rent it back to them at a price that keeps them just viable enough to keep paying. Rowan looked at the maps spread across the table. She could see the rough outline of the region, the ridge lines, the road north, the dry riverbed, the cluster of property lines that indicated the patchwork of smaller ranches east of the creek. Her family's land was on the southeast corner, marked in pencil. He manufactured the debt, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been turning it over since the previous afternoon and was simply confirming aloud. That's what I believe, Crow said. Your father borrowed money twice in the last 2 years that I can find record of. Once from the First Territorial Bank, standard terms, standard interest, nothing unusual. Once from a private lender called the Consolidated Lending Group. He reached across the table and slid a piece of paper toward her. Which is a subsidiary of the Dunmore Land Syndicate. She looked at the paper. The numbers on it were not enormous individually, but the interest terms were structured in a way that she had to read twice to understand, and when she understood them, she felt something cold move through her. At this rate, she said slowly, the debt doubles every 8 months, Crow said. Yes. Did my father know what he was signing? I don't know what your father knew, Crow said, and he said it with a directness that she appreciated, not softened, not apologetic, just honest. I know the document was prepared by attorneys who specialize in making things clear in the fine print and unclear everywhere else. Most men read the number and sign the page. That's what Voss counts on. She sat with that for a moment. Her father had been a careful man in most things, but paperwork had never been his strength. He had always trusted that if a man extended credit in good faith, the terms would be in good faith too. It was the same quality that made him offer water to his neighbors without charging for it, a fundamental belief that people, broadly, operated according to the same principles he did. That belief had killed him, not directly, not with violence, but with the slow and perfectly legal machinery of a man who understood exactly how to use good faith against itself. What can I do about it? She asked. Legally? If you can prove the debt was fraudulent, that the lending terms violated territorial code, or that Voss misrepresented the agreement, you have grounds to challenge the seizure. He paused. The problem is that Voss has been careful. His documents are technically legal. The men he has in the territorial offices have made sure of that. Then not legally, she said. Crow looked at her steadily. I didn't say that. But you didn't not say it. A pause. The morning light was coming in through the office window at a low angle, and outside she could hear one of the hands calling to another about something involving a gate hinge. Normal sounds, the kind that go on regardless. There are documents, he said finally. Records of the arrangements Voss has made with land officials, with the county recorder's office, with the man who was appointed to oversee your father's debt assessment. If those records exist and can be located, they would be something other than technical compliance with the law. He picked up the mug. They would be evidence. Where are they? That's the question. She looked at him across the table. You've been looking into this already, before yesterday. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of a man deciding not how much to say, but how to say what he'd decided to say. 3 of the properties Voss acquired through Dunmore border my land to the east. The owners didn't sell willingly. He set the mug down again. One of them was a woman named Clara Ferris, who had been running her late husband's ranch for 6 years on her own. Voss had her out inside 4 months. She went to live with her sister in the capital. He looked at the map. I should have moved sooner. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, and I had my own operation to manage. It was, she thought, as close to an admission of regret as she was likely to get from him, and she didn't push it. So what do we do? She said. That word, we, sat in the air between them for just a moment. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it stayed. "We go back to the ranch," he said. "Keep." She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. More planning, maybe. More time in the office with the maps and the paperwork. Not a ride back down the ridge road toward Dust Creek and then east along the northern trail to the property she'd been removed from less than 2 days ago. But Crow had a reason. And when he explained it, it was the kind of reason that made sense immediately and also made her stomach tighten. "Whatever documents exist, the most important ones will be connected to the land itself," he said, saddling the dark bay with the efficiency of long practice. "Your father kept records, deeds, correspondence, the original lending agreement. If they haven't been taken already, they'll be at the ranch. And if Voss is as thorough as I think he is, he'll send someone to make sure they disappear," she finished. "If he hasn't already." They rode in a group of 3, Crow, Rowan, and a hand named Beckett, who was somewhere between 30 and 50, and had the kind of quiet competence that announces itself only in the way a person moves. He rode slightly behind and to the right, and didn't speak unless spoken to, and Rowan had the clear sense that he was there, not for the paperwork. The Hale Ranch looked different in the morning light. Or maybe it looked the same and it was Rowan who was different, standing at the gate in the dusty yard looking at the house where she'd grown up. The barn her father had rebuilt after a lightning fire 8 years back. The garden her mother had started and she'd maintained out of habit, and the vague feeling that abandoning it would be abandoning something else. The whole accumulated evidence of a family's presence on a piece of land. And feeling it from outside, the way you feel a thing when you're not sure you're allowed to be there anymore. "It's still yours," Crow said, reading something in her face without her having invited him to. "I know," she said. She didn't go for the house first. She went for the barn, because that was where her father had kept the secondary set of documents, not the important papers, which he'd always filed inside at the desk in the front room, but the working records, the correspondence he hadn't yet responded to, the copies of agreements that the original parties had. She'd thought about it on the ride over. If someone came to clean the place out, they'd go to the desk first. The barn was dim and warm and smelled the way barns smell, which is to say it smelled like her entire childhood, and she stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, and then went to the far wall where her father had built a shallow cabinet behind a loose board with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who knew. Hiding things in loose boards was not sophisticated, but did it anyway. The board was still loose, the cabinet was still there, and the papers were still inside it. She exhaled. There were maybe 40 pages, copies of deeds, water rights documentation, a letter from the county land office dated 3 years back regarding the spring rights that she hadn't known existed, and at the bottom, folded into thirds, the lending agreement from the Consolidated Lending Group with her father's signature at the bottom, and above it, the terms that Crow had described. Looking at them in her father's handwriting and her father's careful signature, Caleb W. Hale, the W standing for Warren, her grandfather's name, she felt the specific grief of understanding how something had happened without being able to stop it from having happened. She took everything. She was folding the last document when she heard the horses. She heard Beckett outside say something quiet and sharp, and then she heard Crow's voice, and then another voice that she didn't recognize, more than one actually, arriving from the direction of the South Road, the road that connected the Hale Ranch to the main track that ran down toward Colton Marsh's property. She came out of the barn into the full sun and saw them. 4 riders stopped at the edge of the yard. The one in front was a man she'd seen before but couldn't immediately name, heavy, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that was too formal for the dust and heat. Behind him were 3 others with the particular way of sitting a horse that comes from spending more time watching for trouble than working cattle. Crow stood between her and the riders. Beckett was positioned off to the left, not dramatically, just positioned. "Miss Hale," the man in front said, looking past Crow at Rowan. "My name is Garrett Luce. I represent the Dunmore Land Syndicate. I have documentation indicating that this property is under syndicate claim pending territorial review." "There's no claim," Crow said. "The debt's been settled." Luce shifted his eyes to Crow with the expression of a man adjusting to an inconvenience. "Mr. Crow, I've heard about your intervention in yesterday's proceedings. I'm sure you understand that a private payment doesn't automatically invalidate a territorial land claim. These things require review. Then they'll be reviewed, Crow said. In the meantime, you're standing on Miss Hale's property. I'm standing on land under active legal dispute, which is a somewhat different... Luce, Crow said very quietly, I know what you were sent here to do, and I'm telling you it's not going to happen today. Take your riders and go back to whoever sent you and tell them the documents they were looking for aren't here. A pause. And that continuing in this direction will cost more than they're willing to spend. Luce was quiet for a moment. He looked at Crow with the assessment of a man trying to determine whether the obstacle in front of him is one he can go around or one he needs to report back about. He glanced at Beckett. He glanced at Rowan, who was standing in the barn doorway with a sheaf of papers under her arm and meeting his eyes without any particular expression. He turned his horse. This isn't settled, he said, to no one in particular. No, Crow agreed. It isn't. They watched the four riders until they were back on the south road and moving away, and then the yard was quiet again except for the wind and the distant sound of a meadowlark that had no idea what had just happened and didn't need to. That was fast, Rowan said. Voss was already watching the property, Crow said. Probably had someone in Dust Creek send word when the auction didn't go as planned. He turned toward her. You found what you were looking for? She held up the papers. My father had the original water rights documentation, and a letter from the land office from 3 years ago. Someone named Territorial Inspector R. Holloway wrote to confirm that the spring rights were formally registered to the Hale estate. She shuffled to the bottom of the stack. The interesting thing is that Holloway's signature appears on the Dunmore Syndicate's land claim, too. Same man. 2 documents with contradictory conclusions. Crow took the paper she held out to him. He read without expression for a moment. Then, for the 3rd time in 2 days, she saw that thing move across his face. That not quite approval. The sense of a man who has been alone in a fight for long enough that finding an ally, even an unexpected one, produces something complicated. This is enough to file a challenge, he said. Is it enough to win one? He looked at her. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. It's enough to make Voss understand he has a real fight on his hands, he said finally. Whether that's enough depends on how many people he can afford to keep in his pocket and how many we can get to stop being afraid of him. She took the papers back and straightened them against her knee and tucked them carefully inside her jacket. Outside the yard, somewhere down the south road, Luce and his riders were carrying a message back to a man she'd never met, who had engineered her father's ruin from the clean remove of legal paperwork and paid intermediaries. She thought about the people of Dust Creek, standing in the street with their eyes down. She thought about Tom Garrett and the Calloway sisters and old Pete Markham and all the other neighbors who had bought eggs from her father and come to her mother's funeral and said nothing while she stood on a platform. She thought about what Crow had said, how many we can get to stop being afraid of him. The other ranchers Voss has squeezed, she said. Are any of them still in the territory? Or did they all end up like Clara Ferris? Gone. Crow considered. Some left. Some are still holding on. There are 3 operations east of the ridge that Dunmore has claims against but hasn't moved on yet, probably waiting for the right season, the right pressure. They need to know about the water, Rowan said. Yes. If I can get them to understand what Voss actually controls, that it's not just their land but the water their land depends on, they have a reason to stand together. She paused. People don't stand together in the abstract. They need a specific reason. The spring is specific. Crow was looking at her in a way she couldn't quite read, not surprised exactly. Something more like the expression of a man recalibrating a position he'd already decided on. It won't be simple, he said. Some of them are more afraid of Voss than they are desperate for water. Fear and desperation run on different timelines. I know, she said, but the drought isn't getting better. She looked around the yard, the house, the barn, the garden that needed watering, the fence line running east toward where the spring sat in its limestone basin, patient and full while the county dried up around it. Her father's land. Her family's 100-year claim to this specific piece of difficult, complicated, water-blessed earth. I'm not leaving, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, and more final than she'd known it was going to be until she heard it. Not a declaration for anyone else's benefit, Just a fact, stated plainly, for the record. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then we should get to work, he said. The first fence came down 3 days after Luce and his riders left the yard. Rowan found it in the morning. The eastern fence line, 200 yards of it pulled clean from the posts, the wire coiled and dragged off into the scrub like it had never been there. No horses had been run through. Nothing had been taken. It was destruction for its own sake, the kind of message that doesn't need a signature because everyone already knows who sent it. She stood at the broken post line for a long moment, looking east, and then she turned around and went back to the house and ate breakfast, and didn't say anything about it for 20 minutes because she needed that time to get her thinking straight before she opened her mouth. Crow had stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't announced it. He'd simply remained after they'd ridden back from retrieving the documents, and by the second evening it was clear that leaving wasn't something he was planning immediately, and she'd made her peace with that. He and Beckett had set up in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Aldana had sent 2 more hands down from the Crow place. The ranch felt occupied in a way it hadn't since her father's last months, when illness had thinned everything down. When she told Crow about the fence, he nodded once and went to look at it himself. And when he came back, he sat at the kitchen table across from her, and they talked about it plainly, which was the only way she had any patience for. "He's not ready to move directly," Crow said. "This is pressure. He wants you spooked, and he wants me to see that holding this position has a cost." "It does have a cost," she said. "Yes." "How many more nights before it becomes something other than fences?" He looked at her steadily. "Honestly, I don't know. Voss has operated through legal mechanisms because it's cleaner and cheaper than violence. But you've disrupted the legal mechanism, and his investors don't like disruption. There's a timeline he's working against that I don't have full visibility into." She poured more coffee into her cup, even though it was already half full, just to have something to do with her hands. "We need the other ranchers, before he moves again." "I know. I want to ride to the Pettifer place today." He didn't argue. She hadn't expected him to. The Pettifer operation sat 7 miles east along the dry creek bed, 300 acres of marginal grazing land, and a small herd that had been shrinking since the drought started. Ed Pettifer was 60-something, a widower, with a son named Nate, who had his father's build and his mother's stubbornness, which was saying something. Rowan had known them her whole life. She had not known, until Crow told her on the ride over, that the Dunmore Syndicate held a lending claim against 40% of the Pettifer land under terms that would accelerate this fall when the annual payment came due. Ed Pettifer came out onto his porch when they rode up with the expression of a man who has been expecting bad news and is deciding whether to be relieved or more worried that it's arrived, wearing a familiar face. "Rowan," he said, "I heard about what happened in town. Terrible thing." He looked at Crow without warmth. "Mr. Crow." "Ed," Crow said. The terrible thing Ed Pettifer had heard about was apparently not something he wanted to discuss on the porch, because he took them inside and poured water, the good water, the rationed water, the kind of hospitality that costs something in a dry year. And they sat at his kitchen table while Nate stood against the wall with his arms crossed, watching. Rowan put the documents on the table, the water rights letter, the Holloway signature, the lending agreement with its buried interest terms. She didn't make a speech about it. She just laid the papers out and let Ed Pettifer read. He read slowly. She watched his face move through several things, confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like anger, trying to decide whether it could afford to be anger or needed to stay as fear for a while longer. "The Consolidated Lending Group," Ed said, without looking up from the page. "Yes. I borrowed from them last spring." He set the paper down. "Different amount, same terms, looks like." "Dad," Nate said, pushing off from the wall. He read over his father's shoulder and his jaw tightened. "We talked about this. You said the interest was standard." "I thought it was standard." Ed's voice came out tired and flat. "The man who came out here, Luce, he called himself, he sat right there where you're sitting, Miss Hale, and he explained the terms, and he was very clear and very polite, and I asked him 3 times was the rate standard, and he said yes. He looked at Rowan. He lied." "He works for Voss," Rowan said. "Garrett Luce. He came to my ranch 2 days ago to collect documents." "What kind of documents?" "The kind that prove what was done to my father." She paused. And what's being done to anyone else who signed with Consolidated? The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside, which had been picking up all morning in the particular way that meant the afternoon would be hard and gritty and unpleasant. Somewhere in the back of the house, something dripped with the irregular rhythm of a roof that had issues. "What do you want from us?" Nate said. Not hostile exactly, just direct in the way of young men who have watched their father worried for too long and have replaced their own worry with the need for something actionable. "I want you to not sign anything else," Rowan said, "and I want you to come to a meeting." "What kind of meeting?" Ed asked. "The kind where everyone who's been touched by Dunmore is in the same room at the same time. So Voss can't work on us one at a time anymore." Ed looked at Crow. There was a long history in that look, not all of it comfortable. Crow's reputation was a complicated thing to be in a room with, and not every man in the territory thought of him as simply a protector. Some thought of him as a different kind of power, the kind that moves slower but takes just as much. "Your involvement in this," Ed said to Crow carefully. "What's the nature of it?" "Personal," Crow said. "Voss has 3 former neighbors of mine. I should have moved on this 2 years ago. I didn't." He met Ed's eyes. "That's the extent of my explanation." Ed sat with that. He was not a fast man, Ed Pettifer, but he was a thorough one. The kind of person who turns a thing over until he's satisfied he's seen all its sides before he puts it down. "Who else would be at this meeting?" he asked. "Harlan Cross, the Moreno family on the North Road. Anyone else we can reach in the next 3 days," Rowan said. "There's not much time. Voss is already putting pressure on the property. The eastern fence came down last night." "Your fence?" "My fence." Ed looked at his son. Nate gave him the very slight nod of a young man trying not to appear as if he's influencing his father's decision and failing. "All right," Ed said. "Where?" The meeting happened on the 4th day, in Rowan's barn, because it was the largest covered space on any of the properties involved, and because holding it on Hale land felt, to Rowan, like a statement worth making. She and Crow spent 2 days riding between the 4 families, Pettifer, Cross, the Morenos, and a 5th operation she hadn't initially known about, the widow Audrey Fenn, who ran 40 acres on her own and turned out to have the clearest understanding of her own lending documents of anyone in the group. 7 adults in total, not counting Crow and Beckett, crowded into the barn on a Thursday afternoon when the heat was bad enough to make everyone short-tempered and the smell of hay and horses made the air dense. Someone had dragged in crates and boards for seating. No one was comfortable. Rowan thought that was probably all right. She stood at the front and laid it out as plainly as she could. What Voss had done to her father, what the water rights documentation showed, what the Holloway signature meant on 2 contradictory documents, what the lending terms added up to when you ran them out to their maturity dates. She used specific numbers because specific numbers don't give people room to argue with the shape of a thing, only the details. Harlan Cross, who was 50 and had the burned, squinting face of a man who spent his life looking into the sun and resented it, interrupted before she was halfway through. "You're telling me Holloway certified Dunmore's claim on the Brixton property," he said, "after he already certified the water rights to your family?" "Same signature," Rowan said, 3 years apart. If the first document is valid, the second is fraudulent. If the second is valid, then someone told him to change his mind, Cross said, or paid him to. Cross looked at the documents she passed to him. He looked at them for a long time. The barn was very quiet. "My daughter works in the land office in Redstone," Audrey Fenn said from the far end of the crates. She was a small woman, dry and precise, who had the habit of waiting until everyone else had spoken before she said anything, which meant that when she spoke, people listened. "She's mentioned Holloway before. Not about this. Just, he lives considerably better than a territorial inspector's salary explains." Several people looked at her. "How long has she worked there?" Crow asked. 4 years. Fenn paused. "She's seen things she doesn't ask questions about because asking questions at the land office seems unhealthy." Her words. "Would she talk to me?" Rowan asked. Fenn looked at her steadily. "She might talk to me first, if I explain what's at stake." That was the best offer she was going to get from Audrey Fenn that day, and Rowan took it. The meeting lasted 3 hours and ended with less resolution than she'd hoped, and more than she'd feared. The Moreno family Felipe and his wife Carmen, who had 2 children and 47 cattle and a lending claim that would come due in the spring, agreed to everything, quickly, with the decisiveness of people who have been waiting for somewhere to put their fear. Harlan Cross agreed to nothing officially, but asked for copies of the documents and said he'd be in contact, which Rowan understood as his version of yes. Ed Pettifer had already committed. Audrey Fenn sat with her hands in her lap and said she would do what was useful, which turned out to be more than almost anyone. The other 2, a man named Willard Burke and his brother-in-law, whose name Rowan never quite caught, listened through the whole meeting and then said they'd think about it and left, and she watched them go with the clear understanding that they were afraid and that being afraid was completely reasonable and that she might not see them again. "You can't save everyone," Crow had said to her the previous evening. "Not in a cruel way, just factually. Some people are too frightened or too compromised or too close to an arrangement with Voss that they can't afford to leave. You work with who you have." She was working with who she had. The writers came on the 9th night. Rowan wasn't asleep when they came. She'd developed the habit over the past week of waking at every sound, the hair-trigger alertness of someone who has been waiting for the next thing and can't relax until it happens. She heard the horses before they reached the gate, heard them spread out in the dark in the way that a single rider doesn't, and she was already dressed and at the window before the first torch appeared. She counted 6. Moving toward the barn first, because the barn was where the documents were now locked in the steel box she'd bought in Dust Creek, and because the barn's other value was that it was made of wood and the country was bone dry. She heard Beckett's voice from the bunkhouse, sharp and low, and then the sound of boots on hardpan, and she came out the back of the house with her rifle because it was the only thing that made sense, and she wasn't going to stand behind a window while men burned her barn. Crow was already in the yard. She didn't know how he'd gotten there so fast. She hadn't heard him, but he was standing at the edge of the torchlight, which put him at a disadvantage that he seemed to have already accounted for, and Beckett was 30 feet to his left, and 2 of the hands from the Crow place who had been sleeping in the bunkhouse were coming from the other direction. The lead rider pulled up. The torch lit his face from below in a way that made him look worse than he probably was in daylight, which was bad enough. She didn't recognize him. One of Voss's hired men, the kind of work that doesn't get associated with an employer publicly. "Mr. Crow," the rider said, with the faint, false courtesy of a man who's been told to be professionally unpleasant. "Mr. Voss sends his regards. He suggests that the situation would be easier for everyone if the Hale property were vacated by the end of the week." "Mr. Voss," Crow said, "can put his suggestion in writing and file it with the territorial court. Mr. Voss prefers a less formal approach." "I know what Mr. Voss prefers." Crow's voice was the same as it always was, low, even, with the kind of steadiness that doesn't need to demonstrate itself because it's not performing anything. "You've got a torch and 6 horses on private property at midnight. That's a criminal matter. I'd encourage you to think about whether the money's worth the charge." The rider was quiet. Behind him, the other 5 horses shifted in the dark, and Rowan could see the torchlight reflecting in eyes, horse and human both. And she kept her own breathing even and her rifle where it was, and did not let herself think about what fire would do to the barn or what was inside it. "The documents," the rider said. "Hand them over, and this becomes a much simpler conversation." "No," Rowan said. The rider looked at her for the first time, as if he'd known she was there but hadn't expected her to speak. "Miss Hale," he said, adjusting to the complication. "You're making this harder than—" "I'm not handing over evidence of a crime to the men who committed it," she said. "Take the message back to Voss. Whatever he's planning next, he should know the documents are no longer only here. Copies went out 3 days ago. To the territorial capital, to a newspaper in Redstone, to people whose names you'd recognize." That last part was not entirely true. She had sent the documents to Audrey Fenn's daughter and to a lawyer she'd found in Redstone through Crow's contacts, but she didn't think now was the time for precision. Burning the barn burns the barn. It doesn't burn the record. Something happened in the rider's face. A recalculation, the kind you can almost see happening. He looked at Crow. Crow said nothing. He just stood there in the torchlight being what he was, which was, apparently, enough. The rider pulled his horse around. The torch swung with the movement. throwing wild shadows across the yard, and then they were going. Not fast, not panicked, but going. And the sound of 6 horses faded into the dark, and the yard went quiet again. Rowan stood in the silence for a long moment. Her heart was hitting hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and her hands were steady only because she had made them be, and she thought, so that was the line. Crow turned and looked at her. "The copies," he said. "How much of that was true?" "Enough of it." He looked at her for another moment. "We need to get to Redstone before he does," he said. "Holloway, the territorial court, the newspaper, Rice, whoever we can reach first, we need to reach. Once we have the challenge formally filed, Voss can't remove documents that are already in the record." "How long to get to Redstone?" "Full day's ride. We leave at first light." She nodded. She looked out past the gate where the dark had swallowed the riders, and she thought about Silas Voss. This man she'd never met, in his office in the Capitol or his house with its lamps and its distance from the consequences of his own decisions. She thought about the torch swinging in the dark. She thought about her father's signature at the bottom of a document he hadn't understood. "He's going to come harder next time," she said. "Yes," Crow said. "He wasn't going to soften that, and she didn't want him to." "Then we need to move faster than he does." She went inside to pack for the ride, and behind her the Badlands night settled back into its usual vast and windswept silence. And somewhere in the limestone basin at the southeast corner of the property, the spring kept running, patient and quiet, waiting to become the thing that decided everything. They rode out before dawn, when the sky was still the deep, depthless black that comes in the hour before first light starts bleeding in from the east. Rowan had packed light, the documents in an oilskin pouch strapped inside her jacket, a change of clothes, enough provisions for 2 days. Crow rode beside her and Beckett behind, and none of them talked much in the first hours because the dark and the cold and the size of what they were riding toward made conversation feel inadequate. She thought about Voss the whole way. She had built him in her mind over the past 2 weeks into something specific. Not a monster, because monsters were easier than this. What she'd built was a man who sat at a desk and looked at numbers and made decisions about people's lives the way you'd make decisions about a livestock operation. Which animals were profitable and which were a drain, which could be worked and which needed to be culled. A man for whom the distance between the decision and its consequence was so large that he never had to feel the weight of either. She didn't know if that was accurate. She'd never met him, but it helped her to think of him that way, because the alternative, that he understood exactly what he was doing to people and did it anyway, was something she'd deal with when she was in the same room with him. Redstone was larger than Dust Creek by a factor of maybe 4, which made it a real town rather than a collection of buildings that had agreed to be near each other. It had a proper courthouse, a newspaper office, 3 hotels, and a land office that occupied the ground floor of a stone building on the main street, with a territorial seal above the door that someone had cleaned recently enough that it still looked official. They arrived in the early afternoon, dusty and stiff from the ride, and Crow went directly to the office of a lawyer named Theodore Marsh, no relation to Colton, he was careful to establish, while Rowan went to find Audrey Fenn's daughter. Her name was Lily, and she was 26, and she worked at a clerk's desk in the back of the land office behind a counter that separated her from the public in the physical way that bureaucratic structures use to communicate that the people behind the counter are the people who decide things, and the people in front of it are there to accept decisions. She had her mother's precision, but not her mother's patience. Rowan could see that within 30 seconds of introducing herself. And when Rowan laid out what she needed, Lily Fenn's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on something that was partly fear and partly relief, the way a person looks when a secret they've been carrying alone suddenly has company. "I've known something was wrong for 2 years, Lily said, low enough that the other clerk across the room couldn't hear. "The Brixton claim, the Hale filing, 3 other certifications that Holloway signed that don't match the primary registry." She glanced at the door. "He comes in every few months to collect copies of things he shouldn't need copies of. I thought about saying something, but I didn't know who to say it to." "You can say it now," Rowan told her. "To a lawyer named Theodore Marsh and then to the Territorial Council. But I need to know, the original certifications, the ones that got altered, are they here, so in the physical records?" Lily looked at her for a long moment. If I show you those, she said, and Holloway finds out, he will find out, Rowan said. I won't lie to you about that. When this goes to the council, the records become evidence. Your name will likely come up. Lily was quiet. She straightened a stack of papers on her desk that didn't need straightening. She looked at the territorial seal on the wall above the counter, the kind of look that goes through a thing rather than at it. My mother said to help you, she said finally. My mother doesn't say things she doesn't mean. No, Rowan agreed. She doesn't. Lily stood up. Give me an hour. The hour became 3, but what came out of it was worth the time. Lily Fenn had not only the original certifications, but a ledger, her own, kept in a personal notebook she'd been adding to for 2 years out of an instinct she couldn't have explained except as a feeling that someone would need it eventually. It documented every irregular filing that had passed through the Redstone Land Office in the period of Dunmore's expansion. Dates, document numbers, Holloway's signature, and in 3 cases, notes about conversations she'd overheard that she'd written down verbatim that same evening in her small, careful hand. When Theodore Marsh read the ledger, he set it down on his desk and was silent for almost a full minute. Miss Fenn, he said, do you understand what this is? It's what I saw, Lily said. She was sitting very straight in the chair across from his desk, both hands in her lap, the posture of someone who has made a decision and intends to stay made. This is a systematic record of fraud conducted through a public office, Marsh said. If authenticated, and I believe it can be, this is grounds not just for a territorial challenge to Dunmore's land claims. This is grounds for criminal prosecution of Holloway, and by extension, of whoever paid him. Voss? Crow said. Voss, Marsh agreed. He looked at Crow with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a lawyer who has been practicing long enough to not be surprised by much. You understand that filing this will produce an immediate reaction from people with significant resources and significant motivation to prevent it from proceeding. We've already had some of that, Crow said. Marsh looked at Rowan. And you, Miss Hale, you're prepared for what comes after filing? The council hearing will be public. Voss will have representation. His investors will bring pressure. This will not be clean. It was never going to be clean, Rowan said. That's not a reason to not do it. Marsh almost smiled. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. He filed the challenge that afternoon, before close of business, in the territorial court that occupied the upper floor of the courthouse on Redstone's main street. Rowan stood in the hallway outside the clerk's office while he went inside with the documents and listened to the sound of paper being stamped and recorded. And she thought about the men who'd come to her door with a leather satchel full of paperwork and told her to pack 1 bag. And she thought about her father's signature on a page he hadn't fully read. And she thought about the platform in Main Street and the crowd that hadn't met her eyes. It was not satisfaction exactly, what she felt. It was too early for satisfaction. But it was something. The sensation of a door opening rather than closing, of motion in a direction she had chosen rather than been assigned. The territorial council hearing was scheduled for 11 days out. Voss moved in 7. She should have expected it would be sooner than 11 days. She'd said as much on the ride back from Redstone, and Crow had agreed, and they'd both known it in the abstract. But there's a difference between knowing a thing in the abstract and being in it. He came to the ranch himself. That surprised her. She had expected another loose, another intermediary, another set of hired men with a message delivered at an inconvenient hour. She hadn't expected the man in person, arriving in the late morning in a clean wagon with 2 riders flanking him, and the careful presentation of someone who has decided that the direct approach is now appropriate. Silas Voss was younger than she'd pictured. Early 50s, lean, with a good coat, and the hands of a man who works with paper rather than land. His face was pleasant in a way that took a moment to identify as intentional, the expression of a man who has practiced looking reasonable. He had gray at his temples and keen, pale eyes that moved quickly around the yard when he stepped down from the wagon, cataloging things. Crow was there. Rowan was there. 3 of Crow's hands were visible, doing things that needed doing, but positioned so that being visible was also something they needed to do. Miss Hale, Voss said. He had a voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man comfortable with rooms. I appreciate you seeing me. You didn't ask, she said, a slight adjustment in the pleasant expression. No, I suppose I should have. He looked at Crow. Mr. Crow, I've heard a great deal about you over the years. I'd hoped we might find occasion to speak directly at some point. We're speaking, Crow said. Voss looked at them both for a moment, calculating something. I'm going to be frank, he said. The filing in Redstone has created a situation that doesn't benefit anyone. My investors are concerned. The hearing process will be expensive, disruptive, and ultimately, I believe, unsatisfying for everyone involved. He paused. I'd like to make a proposal. You can make it, Rowan said. I'm not agreeing to it before I hear it. The debt against the Hale estate is formally cleared. Mr. Crow has seen to that, as I understand. I'm prepared to release the Dunmore claims against the Pettifer, Cross, Moreno, and Fenn properties as well, at no cost to the current holders. Clean title, effective immediately. He let that sit for a moment. In exchange for the withdrawal of the council filing and the return of the documents that were removed from the Territorial Land Office. The yard was quiet enough that she could hear the wind moving through the scrub to the east. The documents that were removed, Rowan said carefully, were copies of records that already exist in the land office. Returning them doesn't change what they say. No, Voss agreed. But without them as submitted exhibits, the challenge has considerably less force. He smiled, pleasantly. Miss Hale, I want to be clear that I'm offering this in good faith. The properties you care about would be protected. The people you've been working with would be free of debt. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, she said. It's also not everything. He looked at her. What about the properties you already hold, the Brixton place, the Ferris property, the 11 others you acquired through the same mechanism you used on my father? She kept her voice level. You're offering to release what you don't have yet and keep what you've already taken. That's not a settlement. That's consolidation. Voss's pleasant expression didn't disappear exactly. It just became something slightly different. The pleasantness of a man who has recognized that he's not going to get what he came for and is deciding how he feels about that. Those acquisitions, he said, were legally conducted. Under documentation signed by a territorial official you were paying, Crow said. That's what the council will be looking at. You can't prove? Lily Fenn's ledger proves it, Rowan said, and Miss Fenn is prepared to testify. Something happened in Voss's face. Small. Just the faintest shift around the eyes, the kind that happens when a man realizes that the situation has walls he hadn't mapped. He'd known about the challenge filing. She doubted he'd known about the ledger. He recovered quickly. That she had to give him. The ledger, he said, is the personal notebook of a junior clerk. Its evidentiary value is for the council to decide, Marsh said. Rowan hadn't mentioned that Marsh had made the ride from Redstone with them. By the slight widening of Voss's eyes, she could see he hadn't known the lawyer was present, standing on the porch behind her. Theodore Marsh, Voss said after a moment. Silas, Marsh said, with the comfortable familiarity of two men who have been aware of each other for a long time without being friends. Voss looked at the assembled group, Rowan, Crow, Marsh, the hands at their positions around the yard, and she could see him doing it. The same calculation Luce's rider had done in the torchlight on that earlier night, assessing whether the obstacle was one he could move through or one that required a different approach. What is it you actually want? He said, and for the first time the pleasantness was fully gone, and what was underneath it was not rage. She'd expected rage, but something more exhausted, the voice of a man who has had to ask this question before and found the answers inconvenient. I want the council to hear the evidence, Rowan said. I want the people you took land from to have legal standing to reclaim it. I want Holloway to answer for what he did. She looked at him. And I want you to stand in the same room with the people whose lives you treated as a ledger entry and not have a door to go through. Voss looked at her for a long time. There was something behind his eyes she couldn't fully read. Not shame, she didn't think, not exactly, but something adjacent to the recognition that the accounting he'd been keeping had finally been submitted to someone who wasn't going to let it balance the way he'd arranged it. He got back in the wagon. I'll see you at the council, he said. Yes, Rowan said. You will. The 11 days were not quiet. Two of Voss's investors made direct contact with the Territorial Council through back channels that Marsh spent considerable time and energy neutralizing. Willard Burke, who had left the barn meeting without committing, turned up in Redstone 3 days before the hearing and filed a statement supporting the challenge, which surprised Rowan and appeared to surprise his brother-in-law even more. Ed Pettifer made the ride to Redstone with Nate and sat in Marsh's office for 4 hours going through his own lending documents line by line, and when he came out, his face had the expression of a man who has finally gotten a clear look at what has been happening to him and has decided what to do about it. Holloway, when the council investigator came to his office, cooperated immediately and completely, the specific cooperation of a man who recognizes that the only variable still under his control is how this ends for him personally. He gave a full account of every irregular certification he'd signed, the payments associated with each, the name of the Dunmore syndicate attorney who'd handled the arrangements, and the dates and amounts of 3 separate payments that appeared in a personal account, held under a name that was not his own. By the time the council convened, the hearing had become something different from what Voss had anticipated when he'd tried to buy his way out of it 10 days earlier. It was no longer a land challenge. It was a reckoning. Rowan spoke for 40 minutes. She did not make a speech. She wasn't equipped for speeches and didn't trust them anyway. She walked through the documents. She identified each signature. She traced each transaction from the Dunmore Syndicate through the Consolidated Lending Group to the individual properties and the individual people who had lost something they'd spent years building. She spoke in specific terms because she had learned in the weeks leading to this moment that specificity is what makes things real. Not the shape of an argument, but the weight of its details. When she was done, Silas Voss's attorney objected to several items of evidence and had 2 of them ruled inadmissible on procedural grounds, and in any other circumstance that might have mattered. But Lily Fenn's ledger was admitted in full. Holloway's testimony was admitted in full. And the original water rights certification, the document that put 2 of Holloway's signatures in direct contradiction, was admitted in full. Voss testified for 20 minutes in his own defense and was very nearly convincing, which was, Rowan thought, maybe the most unsettling thing about him. He was good at this. He had probably been good at it his whole life. But the council had the documents, and the documents didn't require him to be convincing. The deliberation took most of an afternoon. Crow sat beside her in the gallery. He didn't say anything while they waited, and she didn't say anything either, and it was the most comfortable silence she could imagine being in right then. When the council returned, the chair read for 12 minutes. Dunmore's claims against 7 properties were voided. The Holloway certifications were formally invalidated. The matter was referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal review of the fraudulent lending practices. And the Consolidated Lending Group was ordered to produce its full records within 30 days. Voss sat at his table while the chair read. His attorney wrote things down. Voss himself was very still. Not the stillness of someone at peace, but the stillness of someone absorbing a series of blows and not yet sure how many more are coming. When the session closed and the gallery began moving, Rowan stayed in her seat for a moment. The room was emptying around her. Council members departing, Marsh gathering his papers, the various attendants and observers filing toward the doors. Voss passed within 10 feet of her on his way out, flanked by his attorney, and he glanced at her once. She looked back. He didn't stop. He walked through the door and out into the afternoon light of Redstone's main street, and she watched him go, and she noticed that without the pleasant expression and without the wagon and the flanking riders and the position of a man making an offer from a position of strength, he looked like what he was. A man who had been building something on a foundation that was never going to hold and was only now understanding the full weight of what he'd constructed. Crow touched her arm lightly. "Come on," he said. "Let's get some food." She laughed. Not from humor, but from the sudden release of something that had been held for a very long time, and because "let's get some food" was about the most Darius Crow thing he could have possibly said, and because the hearing room was emptying and she was sitting in it, and the day was over and she was still here. "Yeah," she said. "All right." She stood up and gathered her jacket and her bag and walked out through the same door Voss had used, and the afternoon light of Redstone hit her face, and the street was loud with the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business. And she stood on the courthouse steps for just a moment, and let herself feel the size of what the day had been. Not finished. There would be the prosecutor and the 30-day production order, and whatever Voss's investors decided to do next, and the long, slow work of 11 properties finding their way back to the people who should hold them. None of that was finished, but the door that had been swinging shut, it was open now, wide and permanent, and in full view of the territorial record. That was enough for today. The food Crow had promised turned out to be a table at the back of a place on Redstone 2nd Street that served beef stew and cornbread and kept its lamps low enough that the day's accumulated tension had somewhere to dissolve into. Marsh joined them and ordered whiskey and drank it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done the thing he was built to do. Beckett ate 2 portions without comment. Lily Fenn came for an hour and sat across from her mother's description of her, and was quieter than Rowan had expected, in the way of people who have done something that cost them something and are still figuring out if the math was right. "Your job," Rowan said to her at one point. "After today." Lily turned her cup in her hands. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Holloway's gone. They'll appoint someone new. Maybe the new person runs a clean office." She paused. "Maybe they don't, but at least I'll know what a dirty one looks like now." She looked up. "I kept the ledger for 2 years because I thought someone would need it eventually. I wasn't wrong." "No," Rowan said. "You weren't." That was the last thing either of them said about it, because some things don't improve with more words. They rode back the next morning in the early light, the 3 of them strung out along the trail with the Badlands opening up around them in the way it does when the sun first hits it. The red rock going amber and then gold, the shadows pulling long behind every ridge and outcropping, the sky moving from gray to the particular hard blue that meant another hot day and didn't apologize for it. Rowan rode and didn't think about much. She was tired in the specific way of a person whose body has been running on something other than sleep for long enough that real rest feels foreign, and she let the mare's steady pace carry her and watched the country go by and allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to not be working on anything. At some point, Crow pulled his horse up, even with hers. "What happens now?" he said. It was almost exactly what she'd asked him that first morning in Main Street when the dust was still settling. She thought about it genuinely. The prosecutor's office, Voss's production order, Ed Pettifer's paperwork, the Morenos, the other families. She paused. "Clara Ferris." "The woman who went to the Capitol," he said. "Dunmore held the Ferris property under a claim that's now voided. The land reverts. Whether she comes back to it?" Rowan shook her head. "That's her choice, but she should know it's a choice she has." Crow was quiet for a moment. "I'll write to her." She looked at him. "I should have written 2 years ago," he said, without drama, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who keeps an accurate account of his own failures. "I can do it now." She didn't say better late than never, because it was a useless thing to say, and he knew the calculus of it better than any reassurance from her would address. She just nodded, and they rode on. The months that followed were not triumphant in any clean sense of the word. Triumph in the clean sense belongs to stories that end at the courthouse steps, and Rowan's didn't. What the months were instead was work. The territorial prosecutor moved slowly, as prosecutors do, and Voss's attorneys filed objections to the production order that delayed the full record release by 6 weeks. When the records finally came, 2 crates of documents delivered to Marsh's office under territorial seal, they revealed that the Dunmore Syndicate's reach extended to 15 properties total, not 11. 4 more families that no one had known to look for, 2 of them already having relocated, 1 still holding on by whatever margin was left between them and the next payment date. Marsh spent most of a month in the records. Rowan spent most of a month helping him because she had learned over the previous weeks that she had a particular ability for this kind of work. Reading the shape of a fraudulent document, finding the place where the language turned from honest to deliberate, following the money through the layers of corporate nomenclature that Voss had used to put distance between himself and the thing he was doing. It was not a skill she'd known she had. It was one that had been developed in her by necessity, which is the way most real skills arrive. Voss was indicted 8 weeks after the council hearing on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of official corruption. His primary investors, the men with names on courthouse buildings, the ones Crow had mentioned that first morning in his office, moved quickly to separate themselves from the Dunmore syndicate the moment the indictment became public, which told Rowan everything she needed to know about how much of the enterprise had been sustained by proximity to power rather than any genuine confidence in Voss himself. Without the investors, the syndicate had no operating capital. Without operating capital, the remaining hired men, Luce included, found other employment within a week. Voss himself, she heard through Marsh, had gone to the capital to manage his legal situation personally. He was there still, as far as she knew. She didn't spend much time thinking about him, which surprised her a little. She'd spent so many weeks constructing him in her mind as the specific enemy, the organizing force of everything that had gone wrong. And then the council ruling came down and the indictment followed, and he was just a man with attorneys and a declining set of options, and the territory moved on without him because that's what territories do. The land, though, the land took longer. Each of the 15 voided claims had to be processed separately through the land office, now operating under a newly appointed recorder who Marsh had been involved in selecting. A woman from the capital named Peralta, who had the refreshing quality of finding fraud genuinely offensive rather than merely procedurally problematic. Deeds had to be reissued. In 2 cases where the original owners had sold and moved on before the fraud was identified, Marsh had to navigate the complicated question of what the law did and didn't owe people who had accepted a bad deal without knowing it was bad. That question didn't always resolve cleanly. One family got their land back. Another got a partial settlement that was less than what they'd lost and more than they'd expected to recover. One case was still unresolved when the first snow came in November, sitting in Peralta's office under a flag that meant pending further review, which meant it would likely sit there through the winter. Rowan drove Ed Pettifer to Redstone twice to work through his paperwork and sat in Marsh's office while the two of them argued about a fence line that had been in dispute before Dunmore ever arrived and would apparently remain in dispute indefinitely regardless of what the council did, because some disagreements between neighbors are not about land at all, but about the specific quality of a decades-long mutual irritation that has become, in its own way, a form of company. On the second trip, when the Pettifer title was finally clear and signed and officially registered, Ed sat in the wagon for a moment before they started back and looked at the paper and didn't say anything. Nate sat beside him and didn't say anything either. Rowan, sitting in the back with a sack of provisions she'd picked up from the general store, watched them both and thought about her father, about the way he used to sit after something significant had resolved, not in celebration exactly, but in a private acknowledgement, the expression of a man accounting for what something had cost alongside what it had been worth. "Your father would be proud," Ed said without turning around. "Not about the court stuff, just about—" He made a vague gesture, which encompassed the paper in his hand and also apparently something larger than the paper. "You didn't run." "No," she said. "That means something." She didn't answer that either, but she held on to it for a while on the ride back, turning it over the way you turn over a coin that isn't currency anymore, but is still worth keeping. Clara Ferris came back in October. Crow had written to her in early September, a letter that Rowan had not read and had not asked to read, because it was his letter and his accounting to make. Whatever it said, Clara Ferris replied within 2 weeks, and a month after that she arrived in Dust Creek on the afternoon stage with 2 trunks and a directness that announced itself before she'd said a word. She was 43, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been through several things and had the lines to show for it, and wasn't bothered by that. She looked at the Ferris property, her property now, officially, the deed reissued through Peralta's office and waiting for her at Marsh's Redstone office. And she walked its perimeter fence and was quiet for a long time. And then she went back to where Rowan was waiting and said, "Half the livestock is gone and the irrigation ditch needs regrading." "Yes," Rowan said. "The house needs a new roof on the east side." "I noticed." "What's the status of the water access from the Hale Spring?" Rowan had been working on this for 2 months. The question of the spring, how it would be managed going forward, who had access, on what terms, had been the most complicated and most important piece of the reconstruction, because it was the thing Voss had wanted most and the thing that the surrounding community needed most. And those 2 facts together had the potential to create a new version of the same problem if Rowan handled it wrong, She had thought about it the way her father had thought about it, and differently from how her father had thought about it. Her father had believed in openness by instinct, by generosity, by the specific faith of a man who assumed the world would operate in good faith. She believed in it by choice, which was a different thing, not better or worse, but arrived at with eyes open to the fact that generosity without structure is just an opportunity for someone else's exploitation. So she'd built structure, a water compact, 7 signatures, herself, the Pettifers, the Morenos, Harlan Cross, Audrey Fenn, Clara Ferris, and a young rancher named Davies who'd bought a property on the North Road that spring and had heard about the spring from Ed Pettifer and asked to be included. The compact established shared access rights to the spring, usage schedules during peak drought periods, a small collective fund for maintaining the basin infrastructure, and a process for adding new signatories as the community around it grew. It was not a perfect document. Marsh had told her 3 times it wasn't, pointing out gaps in the enforcement provisions and a definition of reasonable use that was vague enough to cause argument. She told him she knew it wasn't perfect, and she intended to revise it when the arguments revealed what needed revision, and he'd looked at her with the expression of a lawyer encountering someone who understands how law actually works in practice rather than how it's supposed to work in theory. She explained it to Clara Ferris standing at the fence line of the Ferris property in the October afternoon, and Clara listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance. "And if someone decides not to abide by the schedule?" Clara asked. "Then the other 6 signatories have standing to say something about it," Rowan said. "Together." Clara looked at her. Something in her face moved. Not warm exactly, but the particular expression of a woman who has learned to not extend warmth easily and is deciding whether this is an occasion to make an exception. "Your father used to just let people take what they needed," she said. "Yes." "That worked because of the kind of man he was." "Yes," Rowan said again. "This works because of something else." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms. "Where do I sign?" The thing about Dust Creek was that it didn't change all at once. Towns don't. People who have been afraid for a long time don't shed it on a schedule. And the shame that Rowan had seen on those faces the morning of the auction didn't transform overnight into something cleaner just because the council had ruled in her favor. Some of those people had watched Colton Marsh bid on her future and done nothing, and would carry that knowledge in the specific private way that people carry the things they're not proud of, not with fanfare, just as a permanent small weight. But things shifted. Slowly, the way the light shifts in the late afternoon, almost imperceptibly until you notice the room is different than it was an hour ago. Tom Garrett from the dry goods store came to see her in September with the expressed purpose of discussing an order of supplies, and spent most of the visit talking about his own experience with a consolidated lending solicitor who had come to his store 2 years prior and been shown the door. He'd been suspicious, he said. He'd been lucky. He hadn't put it together with what was happening to the ranchers around him. He wasn't making excuses. He just thought she should know. She thanked him for telling her. She meant it. The Calloway sisters sent a letter that was long and circuitous and arrived at its point, an apology of a kind, only in the final paragraph, which Rowan read twice and then folded and put in the drawer with her father's pocket watch. Not because she was keeping it as evidence of anything, but because it was a record of people trying to do something that was hard for them, and she had respect for that even when it arrived late. Old Pete Markham came by the ranch one afternoon in early November with a colt he said he'd been meaning to bring around for months. He was almost certainly lying about the months. It was more likely a week. But the colt was a good one, young and well-formed, and Pete sat on the porch with her for 2 hours and talked about cattle and weather, and the way the grassland on the east slope had come in better this fall than the last 3 years combined. And at one point he said without preamble, "I should have said something that morning." And then they both sat with that for a minute and then talked about cattle again. It was not resolution exactly, but it was something real. Bam. The first time it rained, genuinely rained, not the false starts and quarter-inch teases that the summer had offered, was in early December, a 3-day storm that came out of the northwest and dropped 2.5 inches on the hard country and turned the dry creek that gave the town its name back into something that remembered how to move. Rowan stood on the porch of the Hale Ranch on the second morning of the rain and watched it come down on the east slope and fill the tracks in the yard and run off the barn roof in a silver curtain, and thought about her father, who had loved rain with a gratitude that she'd understood as a child, but understood differently now. Not just the relief of moisture in a dry country, but the specific gratitude of a man who knew what absence felt like and didn't take presence for granted. She heard boots on the porch steps and didn't turn around because she already knew the step. Crow stood beside her and looked at the rain. He had a coffee cup in one hand and the other in his coat pocket, and the expression of a man for whom watching weather was a normal and sufficient activity. They had not talked directly about what they were to each other. She wasn't sure they needed to, which was itself an answer of a kind. He had been here more than he'd been at his own place in the past 3 months, and she hadn't asked him to be and hadn't asked him to leave. And Mrs. Aldana had begun sending supplies down from the Crow Ranch on a schedule that suggested she considered the arrangement settled regardless of whether the principals had formalized it, which was very like Mrs. Aldana. "The Morenos are bringing their cattle down to the South Basin next week," Rowan said. "The grass is coming back faster than Felipe expected." "He told me," Crow said. "He also told me Carmen wants to expand the herd in the spring." "Good." He asked if I thought the spring compact would hold long term. "Once the drought breaks and people aren't desperate anymore." She looked at the rain on the slope. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought it depended on whether the people in it remembered what it felt like to need it." He paused. He seemed satisfied with that. "Are you?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He never answered a real question before he'd actually considered it. "I think the compact is a good structure," he said. "I think structures hold when people build them from something true. Your father did it by trust. You did it by—" He seemed to search for the word. "Clarity. You built it clear enough that it doesn't depend on everyone being good, just on everyone understanding the cost of breaking it." She turned that over. "That sounds less optimistic than my father's version." "Maybe," he said, "but it might last longer." The rain came in a gust and reached the edge of the porch roof, and they both stepped back slightly, not enough to be inside, but enough to stay dry. "I want to expand the east pasture in the spring," she said. "Bring the fence line out to the old marker. Put cattle on the slope once the grass is established." "That's a lot of fencing." "I know." "I can send 2 men in March to help with the posts." She looked at him sideways. "I wasn't asking." "I know," he said. "I was offering." She let that sit for a moment, the way you let something sit when it's the right thing and you want to actually feel it rather than move past it too quickly. "All right," she said. She thought sometimes about what the story of this year would look like from the outside. The clean version, the kind that gets told later when the hard edges have been smoothed by time and retelling. A young woman on an auction platform. A man who rides in and stops it. The documents, the fraud, the council hearing, the rain coming back to a dry country. That version wasn't wrong, but it left things out. It left out the 11 hours she'd spent on the night before the council hearing in Marsh's office going over the documents again because she was afraid she'd missed something, and the way her hands had shaken slightly when she'd taken the floor to speak, and how she'd breathed through it and kept going because there was nothing to do but keep going. It left out Ed Pettifer's fear and Lily Fenn's 2 years of keeping a ledger for a reason she couldn't have articulated. It left out Willard Burke, who had walked out of the barn meeting and then shown up in Redstone anyway, which she had never fully understood but had stopped trying to. It left out the Calloway sisters' letter arriving late. It left out Clara Ferris walking her fence line in October with her arms crossed, and that particular expression that comes from being asked to trust something again when trust has been expensive. It left out Crow's admission about Clara 2 years ago. "I should have moved sooner. I didn't." The specific unvarnished cost of a man's decision to stay out of something that turned out to need him. He hadn't forgiven himself for that, she didn't think. He was the kind of man who keeps accurate accounts of those things. But he'd moved when moving still mattered, and she thought that was the most anyone could honestly say about themselves. Not that they got it right immediately, but that they didn't stay wrong forever. Because that was the thing the clean version of the story couldn't hold. The real lesson, if that was even the right word for it, which she wasn't sure of, Wasn't that good people win and bad people lose, and the truth comes out and justice follows? Sometimes it does. This time it had more or less imperfectly, with delays and incomplete resolutions, and at least one family who got a partial settlement and not their land back. The real thing was smaller and harder to say. It was about what you do with the time between when something goes wrong and when you can start making it right. Whether you hold the line, your actual line, not the performance of one, in the hours when it's just you and the cold and the darkness and the sound of horses coming that you didn't invite. Whether you tell the truth when it's inconvenient, whether you open the door, even partially, even imperfectly, to the people who are afraid the same way you're afraid, whether you let yourself be helped. That last one had been harder for her than any of the rest of it. She had stood on that platform in Main Street and made a private vow to herself about self-sufficiency, about not needing, about the specific armor that a person builds when they've been publicly reduced to a price. And Crow had come, and she had accepted what he offered, not gratefully in the performed sense, but genuinely, because it was the right thing to accept, and because refusing it would have been pride dressed up as strength. And she'd watched too many people make that mistake to repeat it. Her father had held the water and given it freely and been taken apart for it. That was a true thing and a sad thing, and it also wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that what he'd built by holding that water and sharing it, the years of goodwill, the neighbors who remembered, the specific texture of a community that knows it can ask when it needs, that had survived him, that had shown up in the Pettifers and the Morenos, and in old Pete Markham on a porch in November saying things he should have said in June. It had even shown up in the Calloway sisters' circuitous letter, which was a form of the good his life had generated finally finding its way home. Nothing her father had built was wasted. It had just been slow. She was 23 years old, and she had learned things this year that she suspected she would spend the rest of her life working out the implications of. That was fine. The Badlands were patient. The spring had been running since before her great-grandfather found it, and would be running after everyone now alive had stopped needing it. You did what you could with the time you had, and you tried to leave the ground a little better than you found it, and you didn't confuse having survived with having finished. The rain continued through the afternoon. The creek at the edge of the property moved with actual water for the first time in months. In the east pasture, the grass that had been fighting the drought for 2 seasons lifted almost visibly in the wet. Crow went inside at some point. There was paperwork he'd been putting off, something about a fence line dispute with a neighboring claim that predated all of this and would apparently outlast it. And she stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the rain do what rain does when it finally arrives in a place that has needed it. The pocket watch was in her jacket. She'd started carrying it 3 months ago, after leaving it on windowsills and mantelpieces as if it needed a permanent place to rest. It didn't. It was a watch. It was made to be carried. She held it in her palm for a moment, the familiar weight of it, the worn smoothness of the case, the small sound of it running. Her father's voice. Water in a dry country is like air. You don't own it. You just hold it for a while and pass it on. She closed her hand around the watch. The rain came down on the Hale Ranch, and on the Pettifer land 7 miles east, and on the Moreno pastures and the Ferris property and the cross operation and the ground that the Dunmore Syndicate no longer held. And it ran down the limestone basin at the southeast corner and filled the spring that had waited through the whole long summer of drought and fraud and fear and human imperfection, patient and indifferent and entirely full. She put the watch back in her pocket. There was work to do tomorrow. There was work to do for a long time. That was all right. She went inside.